Detective Agatha Marple. The Haunting of Draycott Manor. A Detective Tales. Chapter 1. Shadows at Draycott Manor. The moor stretched endlessly under a slate-grey sky, a patchwork of rolling mist and wind-tossed heather. In the distance, Draycott Manor loomed like a forgotten sentinel of a bygone era, its jagged turrets cutting stark silhouettes against the horizon. Agatha Marple, modestly dressed in a sensible coat and hat, adjusted her gloves as the car rattled to a halt before the grand wrought-iron gates. The gates creaked open, unwelcoming and reluctant, and the driver, a sullen young man with an anxious twitch, muttered, "Good luck, miss. You'll be needing it." Agatha's sharp eyes took in every detail as she stepped onto the gravel path. The manor itself was a sprawl of Gothic architecture, its ivy-clad walls and narrow windows suggesting a house that held more secrets than its occupants dared admit. The air was heavy, as though charged with the weight of unsaid things. Lady Eleanor Draycott awaited her in the grand hall, a cavernous space lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The woman was a picture of frailty, her slender frame swathed in black mourning clothes, a string of pearls trembling at her throat. "You must be Miss Marple," she said, her voice brittle yet commanding. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We are in desperate need of your expertise." Agatha offered a polite smile. "I understand there have been some unfortunate occurrences." "Unfortunate?" Lady Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "Murders, Miss Marple. My brother Edward was found dead in the library only a fortnight ago. Before that, our housekeeper dead in the East Wing. And before that, she trailed off, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. The villagers are saying it's the curse." Agatha did not respond immediately, letting the silence stretch. It was a technique she often employed. People tended to fill the void with truths they might otherwise keep hidden. Lady Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "I don't believe in curses," she added finally, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "Well," Agatha said lightly, "the truth has a way of being far more practical than the imagination allows." The guest room prepared for Agatha was as cold and foreboding as the rest of the manor. Heavy curtains framed narrow windows blocking out the dim light, while a four-poster bed, draped in dark velvet, dominated the room. As Agatha unpacked her small suitcase, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. She paused, eyes narrowing, before bending to retrieve it. The note, written in a hurried scrawl, read, "Leave now. You are not welcome here. The dead do not rest." Agatha turned the note over, finding no signature. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as an intimidation tactic, but the timing was curious. She had been in the manor less than an hour. She tucked the note into a notebook, her mind already cataloguing the possibilities. Was it a threat from someone within the household, or an attempt to frighten her away before she could begin her work? Later that evening, Agatha joined Lady Eleanor in the drawing room, where a fire crackled weakly against the oppressive chill. Over a cup of tea, the matriarch elaborated on the so-called curse. "It began centuries ago," she said, her voice hushed. "My ancestor, Lord Arthur Draycott, was accused of betraying his wife. They say she cursed the house as she lay dying, vowing vengeance on all who bore the Draycott name. Since then, tragedy has followed this family like a shadow." "Fascinating," Agatha murmured, sipping her tea. "And yet, curses require human hands to enact them, do they not?" Lady Eleanor blinked, clearly unsettled by Agatha's calm pragmatism. "Perhaps. But what other explanation is there?" Agatha set down her cup. "I intend to find out, Lady Draycott. With your permission, I would like to speak with the household staff tomorrow. Someone here knows more than they are saying." Lady Eleanor hesitated before nodding. "Very well. But please, Miss Marple, be careful. This house has claimed too many lives already." That night, as Agatha lay in bed, the oppressive silence of the manor seemed to press against her. Faint creaks echoed through the walls, and the wind outside howled like a distant lament. She slept lightly, her mind replaying the details of Lady Eleanor's story and the cryptic note. At some point past midnight, a floorboard creaked just outside her door. Agatha's eyes snapped open, and she sat up, her senses sharp. But when she stepped into the hallway, it was empty, the flickering candlelight casting distorted shadows. The sense of unease was undeniable, but Agatha was no stranger to such settings. As she returned to her room, she resolved to unravel the truth, curse or no curse. The manor held its secrets tightly, but Agatha Marple was even tighter in her resolve to uncover them. Chapter 2. The Ghostly Premonition. The night had settled heavily over Draycott Manor, the moor cloaked in an impenetrable darkness. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath, its winding corridors and cavernous rooms caught in a hush broken only by the occasional groan of shifting timber. Agatha Marple, ever the light sleeper, lay awake in her chilly guest room, her ears tuned to the peculiar acoustics of the sprawling estate. Somewhere beyond her door, a floorboard creaked. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw her from her bed. Draping a shawl over her shoulders, she lit a small candle and stepped into the dim hallway. The manor stretched before her in shadows and whispers. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and faint traces of lavender, but beneath it was a sharper tang of damp stone. A gust of wind rattled a window pane, drawing Agatha's gaze to the far end of the corridor. There, silhouetted against the pale moonlight filtering through a tall window, was a figure. It was fleeting, a mere flicker of movement, but it was enough to quicken her pulse. The figure turned abruptly, disappearing down the stairwell. Agatha followed, her steps silent against the creaking floor. She reached the landing, but the staircase below was empty. The chill was sharper here, the air as still as a held breath. Curious, she murmured, her gaze lingering on the faint imprint of a shoe in the thin layer of dust on the steps. The next morning, over a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade, Agatha began her inquiries. Lady Eleanor had graciously allowed her to question the household, though the matriarch's nervous glances suggested she expected resistance. First was Mrs. Travers, the long-serving housekeeper with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye. "Ghosts," she scoffed when Agatha broached the topic of the manor's haunted reputation. "No such thing, Miss Marple. But there's a darkness in this house, mark my words. Too much tragedy for there not to be. And the night Sir Edward died," Agatha prompted gently. Mrs. Travers hesitated. He'd been in the library, as was his habit. Liked to read late, he did. "I found him the next morning stone cold in his chair. No wounds, no blood, just gone." Agatha's brow furrowed, and nothing unusual that evening. The housekeeper's eyes darted to the side. There was a sound like a moan, or maybe the wind. But this place makes all sorts of noises. Next was Martin, the young footman, whose skittish demeanor betrayed his inexperience. He stumbled over his words as he described the night in question. I was setting the fire in the east wing, miss. Didn't hear a thing. But well, some of the lads talk of seeing shadows." "What kind of shadows?" Martin wrung his hands. "Moving ones." But no one there. Agatha filed the detail away, thanking him with a sigh that seemed to ease his nerves. Lady Eleanor was last, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Edward was difficult, she admitted. He had a temper, especially about the family finances, but he was devoted to this house, to preserving it. Agatha leaned forward, devoted enough to make enemies. Lady Eleanor flinched. Perhaps. He was strict with the staff, and he'd had arguments with my nephew, Julian, about the estate. But murder? No, Miss Marple. That's something none of us could imagine. After luncheon, Agatha asked to see the library where Edward had been found. It was a grand room, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of old paper. The desk where Edward had perished remained untouched, save for the removal of his body. Agatha's eyes roved the scene with meticulous care. A peculiar detail caught her attention, a torn piece of fabric, snagged on the armrest of the leather chair. It was dark green, a shade that matched none of the staff uniforms or Lady Eleanor's attire. Moving behind the desk, she noticed a series of faint carvings scratched into the wood. They were irregular, almost frantic, as though made in haste. Shapes that might have been letters or symbols, but their meaning eluded her. As Agatha examined them, the light shifted, casting a reflection from the glass of a nearby cabinet. Inside, a set of silver candlesticks gleamed, their surfaces polished to perfection. But there was an odd smudge on the nearest one, as though someone had handled it with unclean hands. Agatha stepped back, her mind ticking. A torn fabric, cryptic symbols, and the curious detail of the candlestick. Separately, they were nothing more than curiosities, but together they hinted at a narrative yet to be uncovered. She turned to Lady Eleanor, who had lingered at the doorway. "Lady Draycott," Agatha said, her voice steady, "I'll need a list of everyone who had access to this room. And if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to know who owns a green coat." Lady Eleanor looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. Whatever you need." As she left the library, Agatha couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The walls of Draycott Manor seemed to lean closer, their silent weight pressing against her thoughts. The truth was here woven into the very fabric of the house. She only needed to unravel it. Chapter 3. The Rivalry. The morning dawned with the manor shrouded in a thick mist, the moor beyond its grounds fading into a pale grey oblivion. Breakfast in the dining room was a formal affair, with polished silver and fine china clinking softly under the strained silence. Agatha Marple, seated discreetly near the foot of the table, observed the interplay among the family members with a detached curiosity. The conversation took an interesting turn when Lady Eleanor, pale and weary-eyed, mentioned the Draycott jewel. "Ah, yes, the infamous heirloom," Sir Julian Carruthers scoffed, breaking the stillness with a sneer. "A fine excuse for every bit of misfortune that's befallen this house." Lady Eleanor's expression tightened. "It's not an excuse, Julian. The theft of the jewel marked the beginning of the family's troubles. You can't deny the coincidence." "Coincidence?" Julian's tone was dripping with derision. "The Draycotts are cursed, Eleanor, but not by a piece of stone. It's far more mundane poor management, greed, and frankly, idiocy." Eleanor's hands clenched around her teacup, but she said nothing. It was Agatha who broke the tension, her voice calm yet curious. "Perhaps, Sir Julian, you'd indulge me with the story of the jewel? I'm afraid I've only heard whispers." Julian leaned back in his chair, clearly relishing the attention. "Ah, the Draycott jewel. A gaudy monstrosity, if you ask me, a sapphire of unnatural size, set in gold and studded with diamonds. It was stolen nearly 50 years ago, in a robbery that remains unsolved. Legend has it the thief cursed the house before disappearing, though I suspect the so-called curse is merely family superstition run amok. And yet," Agatha pressed gently, "the events that followed seemed peculiar. An uncanny coincidence, surely." Julian shrugged. "Uncanny, perhaps, but curses are the refuge of the gullible. If you ask me, someone in the family likely sold the jewel and invented the theft to cover their tracks." Lady Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough, Julian. You've made your disdain for the family abundantly clear." She swept from the room, leaving an uneasy silence in her wake. Agatha waited until the breakfast party dispersed, each member retreating to their own corner of the sprawling estate. Sir Julian, she noted, retired to the library with a newspaper, his earlier venom replaced by a facade of indifference. She spent the morning exploring the manor under the guise of admiration. Her true goal, however, was to gain insight into the household's dynamics and its secrets. Her wandering brought her to Sir Julian's study, a room that was surprisingly austere for a man of his bluster. The desk was tidy, the bookshelves lined with volumes that looked more decorative than read. But it was a locked drawer in the desk that caught her attention. A careful inspection revealed the drawer was not as secure as its owner might have hoped. Agatha retrieved a small hairpin from her bag, a tool she had found surprisingly versatile over the years, and set to work. Within moments, the lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, she found a stack of correspondence, most of it mundane letters from acquaintances, bank statements. But among them was a single, folded letter on thin paper. The words written in bold, slanted handwriting were damning. Carruthers. The debt stands at piece 5,000. Pay by month's end or face the consequences. Your reputation won't survive the truth. Agatha's eyes narrowed as she carefully replaced the letter and locked the drawer once more. Julian's bravado at breakfast now seemed like the posturing of a man drowning in secrets. As she stepped back into the corridor, she nearly collided with Lady Eleanor, who regarded her with a faintly suspicious expression. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice cool. "You seem very interested in our home." "Curiosity, my dear," Agatha replied smoothly, her tone light. "A house as storied as this holds so many tales. One can't help but explore." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing further, disappearing down the hall. Agatha watched her go, her mind already piecing together the connections. The Draycott jewel, Julian's gambling debts, the family's whispered curse, all threads in a tapestry that might lead to the truth. For now she would wait and watch. Draycott Manor, she suspected, had many more secrets yet to reveal. Agatha lingered briefly in the corridor after her encounter with Lady Eleanor, allowing her sharp mind to churn through the possibilities. The letter she had uncovered painted Sir Julian Carruthers in a distinctly unsavory light. Gambling debts, coupled with his disdain for the family's legacy, made him a suspicious figure. But could they make him a murderer? With her usual unhurried stride, Agatha descended the grand staircase toward the manor's drawing room. It was a cavernous space, filled with heavy furniture and lined with dark wood paneling. The thick drapes at the windows dimmed the sunlight, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to reflect the household's mood. She found Sir Julian ensconced in an armchair by the hearth, swirling a glass of brandy despite the early hour. His newspaper lay discarded on the side table, and his eyes were fixed on the flames. "Ah, Miss Marple," he drawled, catching sight of her. "Come to probe further into the sordid history of the Draycotts." "Not at all, Sir Julian," Agatha replied, settling herself into a nearby chair. "I merely wish to better understand the family dynamics. It must be difficult, living under the shadow of such an enduring legend." Julian gave a humorless laugh. "Legend? More like a millstone around the family's neck. The Draycotts have clung to their ghosts and curses like a drowning man to a rope. And where has it got us? A crumbling estate and a string of tragedies. But surely the Draycott jewel was no mere superstition." Agatha ventured, her tone mild. A sapphire of such value could hardly be imagined. Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment his gaze was distant. The jewel was real enough, but its so-called curse? Nothing more than a convenient excuse for misfortune. Eleanor clings to it because it gives her a reason to avoid the truth. "And what truth might that be?" Agatha asked, tilting her head slightly. "That our family is as flawed as any other," Julian snapped, draining his glass. "Greed, envy, secrets, they're the real curse of the Draycotts." Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you remain. Why not leave the manor and its troubles behind?" Julian's expression darkened. "This is my home, Miss Marple, for better or worse. I've as much right to it as Eleanor." Agatha caught the faintest flicker of something in his tone, resentment, perhaps, or guilt. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for your candor, Sir Julian. It's been most enlightening." As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, Agatha returned to her room. She retrieved her notebook, jotting down her observations with meticulous precision. Sir Julian's gambling debts, his derision toward the family, his insistence on remaining at the manor all pointed to a man with motives worth examining. Yet Agatha knew better than to leap to conclusions. Appearances, she had learned, were often deceiving. A faint knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Agatha opened it to find Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, standing there with a wary expression. "Pardon the intrusion, Miss Marple," the woman said, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "But I thought you ought to know Sir Julian and Lady Eleanor had words earlier in the library," raised voices and all. And then he stormed out. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris," Agatha said, her expression betraying little of her curiosity. "I'll keep that in mind." As the housekeeper departed, Agatha sat back down, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her notebook. The rivalry between Eleanor and Julian seemed to run deeper than mere disagreements over family legend. The question was, how deep and how dangerous did it go? There was more to uncover, and Agatha intended to unravel every thread. For now, though, she would wait. The manor's secrets had a way of revealing themselves, often in the most unexpected ways. Chapter 4. The First Betrayal. The evening descended upon Draycott Manor with the weight of a gathering storm. The shadowy corridors seemed to whisper secrets, and the air was thick with unease. Agatha Marple, however, moved with unhurried precision, her sharp eyes noticing the faintest of details others might overlook. The sound of the mantel clock ticking in the drawing room was the only accompaniment to the conversation between Agatha and Mr. Higgins, the aging butler. He stood stiffly, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. "Come now, Mr. Higgins," Agatha said gently but firmly, her gaze fixed on his face. "You've worked at Draycott Manor for decades. You know its sounds, its creaks, its whispers. Surely you noticed something unusual the night of Edward's death." The butler hesitated, his thin lips pressing together as if holding back a confession. Finally he sighed, the wariness of guilt evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I did, Miss Marple," he admitted quietly. "I heard footsteps. Unfamiliar ones pacing outside the library. But when I mentioned it to Lady Eleanor the next morning, I was advised to hold my tongue." Agatha tilted her head. "Advised by whom?" Higgins avoided her gaze, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A note was left for me in the servants' hall. It contained money and a simple message for your silence. I didn't see who left it, but I knew better than to ask." Agatha leaned back, her expression contemplative. "And you have no suspicion of the sender?" "None, Miss Marple. But whoever it was, they wanted the truth buried." She thanked him and left the drawing room, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The butler's silence was troubling, but more troubling still was the realization that someone within the manor was willing to pay to obscure the truth. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. Lady Eleanor had spent the day insisting on a séance, declaring that the spirits of the manor's cursed past would provide answers. Though the family expressed varying degrees of skepticism, none dared oppose her outright. The séance was held in the cavernous dining hall, the long table stripped bare and replaced with a circular one covered in a velvet cloth. A flickering candelabra provided the only light, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, sat at her mother's side, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary. Sir Julian looked visibly annoyed, muttering under his breath about superstitious nonsense, while the rest of the household watched in uncomfortable silence. The medium, a local woman named Mrs. Fenwick, began her incantations, her voice low and wavering as she called upon the spirits of the departed. Agatha, seated in the corner, observed with a mixture of detachment and intrigue. She noted the overly dramatic flair of the medium, the precise placement of props, and Margaret's wide-eyed expressions, which seemed a shade too rehearsed. Suddenly the medium's voice rose in a chilling crescendo. "The spirit speaks. It cries out against betrayal. The murderer is among us." A sharp cry escaped Lady Eleanor's lips, and the room erupted into chaos. Sir Julian stood, demanding an end to the spectacle, while Margaret clung to her mother, murmuring reassurances. Amid the commotion, Agatha's gaze fell on Margaret's trembling hands, where she caught a glimpse of something unusual, a faint smudge of ash on her palm, as if she had handled one of the séance's burning candles herself. Later that night, Agatha found Margaret alone in the drawing room, her composure frayed. The young woman turned at the sound of Agatha's entrance, her eyes wary. "I must commend your performance during the séance," Agatha said lightly, taking a seat across from her. "Convincing enough to rattle the household, though not convincing enough to fool me." Margaret's face turned ashen. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Agatha said, her tone soft but unyielding. "The smudge of ash on your hand, the too perfect timing of the spirit's accusations. It was staged, wasn't it? Designed to divert attention away from something you'd rather keep hidden. Margaret's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her facade trembling. "I only wanted to scare them," she admitted, "to make them feel the same fear I've felt, living in this cursed house. But I didn't kill Edward, I swear it." Agatha regarded her for a long moment. Margaret's fear was genuine, but so too was her desperation to manipulate the situation. "Fear," Agatha said softly, "is a powerful tool. But in the wrong hands, it can become a weapon." Margaret said nothing, her silence confirming what Agatha already suspected. Margaret's guilt lay not in murder, but in deception. Yet the real killer was still at large, and the shadows of Draycott Manor grew darker with each passing hour. For Agatha Marple, the séance had not revealed the murderer, but it had certainly revealed where to look next. Chapter 5. The Macabre Revelation. The evening air wrapped Draycott Manor in a suffocating stillness, the moonlight barely penetrating the shroud of mist that clung to the moors. Inside the manor, the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creak of floorboards as Agatha Marple made her way to the library. Her footsteps were deliberate, her mind sharp with suspicion. The library, grand and foreboding, seemed to hold its breath as Agatha entered. She moved with purpose, her keen eyes scanning the intricate woodwork of the shelves and the heavy drapes that framed the tall windows. The symbols carved into Edward's desk had lingered in her thoughts, their strange geometry hinting at something deliberately obscure. Her fingers traced the edges of the carvings, pausing at a particularly deep groove near the edge. With a soft click, a hidden latch gave way, and a section of the bookshelf creaked open to reveal a dark passage. Agatha lit a small lantern she had brought with her, its warm glow illuminating the narrow staircase descending into the unknown. The air grew colder as she stepped carefully down, the scent of damp earth mingling with something more acrid decay. At the bottom of the staircase lay an abandoned cellar. It was filled with dust-covered relics of the Draycott family's past, tarnished silver goblets, faded portraits, and a broken chest spilling fragments of yellowed parchment. In the corner of the room, Agatha's lantern revealed a more sinister sight: a makeshift altar, its surface adorned with melted candle stubs and faint traces of dried wax. On the floor beside it lay a small vial, its contents long evaporated but unmistakably marked with the residue of poison. Agatha's breath caught as her eyes fell on a folded piece of parchment resting near the vial. It bore the same symbols carved into Edward's desk, now clearly recognizable as part of an ancient ritual. This was no curse, she murmured to herself. It was deliberate. Returning to the manor with her findings, Agatha sought out Lady Eleanor, only to find her pacing nervously in the drawing room. Margaret and Sir Julian were absent, their alibis suddenly fragile in Agatha's mind. "Lady Eleanor," Agatha began gently, "the Draycott curse is no more real than the idea of this manor being haunted. But someone very much alive has worked hard to make it seem otherwise." Eleanor's face paled. "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" Agatha held up the parchment. The symbols Edward carved into his desk weren't warnings, they were part of a ritual. A false one, meant to perpetuate fear and cover for something far more mundane: greed. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "I suspect Sir Julian and Margaret have been collaborating to exploit the curse narrative, and I believe it began years ago with the theft of the Draycott jewel." Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her trembling hands clutching her shawl. "You can't mean Julian is my cousin and Margaret my own daughter." "Surely you're mistaken." But Agatha's gaze was unwavering. "The theft of the jewel wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, Lady Eleanor. It required planning, and, I suspect, a scapegoat. By invoking the curse and staging Edward's death as part of a ritual, they've ensured that suspicion falls everywhere but on them." The confrontation came later that evening, in the grand dining room. Agatha had summoned Sir Julian and Margaret under the pretense of discussing the family's safety, but her questions quickly turned pointed. "Edward wasn't killed because of the Draycott curse," she said, her voice firm. "He was killed because he began to suspect the truth about the jewel. Isn't that right, Sir Julian?" Julian's composure faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "You're speaking nonsense, Miss Marple." "The curse is an elaborate lie," Agatha interjected, "and one you and Margaret have perpetuated to keep your theft hidden. Edward must have discovered something, a ledger perhaps, or an overheard conversation that made him a liability." Margaret's face crumpled under the weight of the accusation. "I didn't want him dead," she blurted. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Agatha's eyes softened slightly, but her resolve remained. "And yet it did. Fear has a way of snowballing, my dear, and greed is never easily satisfied. But the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, always finds its way to the surface." With Margaret's confession and Julian's reluctant admission, the pieces of the puzzle fell neatly into place. The vial of poison had been taken from the manor's old medical supplies, and the symbols were copied from a forgotten Draycott diary Julian had stumbled upon years ago. As the local constable arrived to take the guilty parties into custody, Agatha remained behind in the library, her gaze lingering on the now sealed passageway. The Draycott jewel had been recovered, but the cost of its return weighed heavily on her mind. Lady Eleanor approached her quietly. "Will the curse ever leave this place, Miss Marple?" Agatha gave a faint, knowing smile. "The only curses, Lady Eleanor, are those we bring upon ourselves. Let that be a lesson the Draycott family takes to heart." With that, she stepped into the moonlit corridor, the shadows of the past left to rest once and for all. Chapter 6. The Truth Unveiled. The grand hall of Draycott Manor was cloaked in an uneasy stillness, the dim light of the chandelier reflecting off the aged mahogany walls. Agatha Marple stood at the center of the room, her petite frame dwarfed by the imposing space. Before her sat Lady Eleanor, Sir Julian, and Margaret, their faces etched with varying degrees of anxiety and defiance. Agatha's voice, calm yet commanding, broke the silence. "When I arrived at Draycott Manor, I was told this house was haunted by a curse, a vengeful spirit seeking retribution for a stolen heirloom. But it was not a ghost that killed Edward Draycott. It was greed and desperation." Lady Eleanor gasped, her trembling hands gripping the arms of her chair. Julian, ever the picture of aristocratic arrogance, leaned back with a smirk. "Miss Marple, these theatrics are entertaining, but surely you don't expect us to take this seriously." Agatha ignored him, her sharp eyes fixed on Margaret. "You, my dear, were the first to play upon the family's superstitions. The staged hauntings, the creaking floorboards, the shadows in the corridors were all part of your attempt to keep the family in a state of fear. Fearful people don't ask questions, do they?" Margaret's face crumpled, her hands wringing the folds of her dress. "I didn't want anyone hurt," she whispered. "I just wanted them to stop looking at the accounts, stop questioning where the money was going. I couldn't let Mother know how bad it had gotten." Eleanor's gasp this time was sharper, more wounded. "Margaret, you could have come to me." "Why didn't you?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Because you'd never have forgiven me. You would have blamed me for every failure, every mistake." Agatha turned to Julian, her voice like a scalpel. "And you, Sir Julian? While Margaret played at shadows, you used the opportunity to silence Edward. He discovered the truth about the jewel, didn't he? That it wasn't stolen by an outsider at all, it was you." Julian's smirk faltered. "This is preposterous." Agatha stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You've been drowning in gambling debts for years, haven't you? Stealing the jewel was your way out, but when Edward found your correspondence with the buyer, he became a threat. Poisoning him was convenient, a tidy way to silence him, while leaving Margaret's hauntings to take the blame." Julian shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. "Do you have proof of these absurd accusations?" Agatha smiled faintly. "I do. The vial of poison I found in your study bears traces of the same substance that killed Edward, and the hidden ledgers in the cellar. They match the sums you've been funneling to cover your debts." For a moment Julian stood motionless, the mask of composure slipping to reveal the raw desperation beneath. With a resigned sigh, he sank back into his chair. Edward was going to ruin everything, he muttered. As the constable led Julian and a tearful Margaret away, Lady Eleanor remained frozen in her chair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Agatha approached her quietly. "I'm sorry for your losses, Lady Eleanor. Greed and fear often twist people into shadows of themselves." Eleanor looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I knew my family. I thought I could trust them." Agatha's expression softened. Trust is a fragile thing, especially when ambition clouds judgment. But perhaps this will be a chance for the Draycotts to start anew, without the weight of old lies and secrets. The wind howled as Agatha stepped outside, the chill biting at her cheeks. The manor loomed behind her, its windows dark and foreboding. As she descended the front steps, the sound of the wind carried an eerie echo, a faint wail like a lament from the moors. Pausing, Agatha glanced back at the manor, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Ghosts may not kill," she murmured, "but people sure do." Pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders, she strode into the night, leaving the cursed house to its silence.